Hi, you're listening to Doth Protest Too Much, podcast discussions on Protestant historical theology. I'm your host, Reverend Andrew Christensen, an Episcopal priest and school chaplain that serves in the Episcopal Diocese of Western Louisiana. What is historical theology? Well, it's the story of the church, and not merely church history, but the beliefs and theology of Christianity as these developed over time. Sometimes this includes the stories of people who shaped Christian thought, as well as the events that had significant impact on them. This podcast brings on a variety of guests. They include scholars who've contributed to the study of different church history and theology topics, and also ministers and others who possess an area of knowledge or firsthand experience in the topics that we discuss. What do we mean by Protestant? Well, as an Episcopal priest and theologian, Paul Zahl once put in an article titled For First Things, Things That Remain. What I mean by Protestant, Reverend Zahl says, I mean a version of Christianity that recognizes no curtain or veil between God and man, save my sin and God's perfect goodness. By Protestant, I mean a version of Christianity that focuses utterly on the unmediated need of us and the unmediated response of God. By Protestant, I mean an impatience with anything that is secondary to this, unquote. I'll add to this that it's important to note that Christianity is both Protestant and Catholic. Protestantism, as it arose in the 16th century, is a particular expression of that Catholicity. Even Reverend Zahl says in the very article I quoted from a moment ago that the term Catholic refers to, quote, the historically continuous Orthodox society of Christian believers, unquote. We are not necessarily a pro-Protestant podcast in the sense of being anti-Roman Catholic or anti any other church body not considered Protestant, like Eastern Orthodoxy, for instance. In fact, some of our guests and listeners come from those very traditions. We are ecumenical and not partisan. Rather, our focus on this podcast is to particularly explore the Reformation era and the ecclesial bodies that descend from the Reformation tradition, whether Lutheran, Reformed, my own tradition of Anglicanism, or even later revivalist Christian movements in North America. From the Reformation to modern theology, the recent history of the Church proves over and over to be fascinating, whether it's the scholastic era of Protestant orthodoxy, the intra-Protestant debates over the theological differences between the different reformers, the various spiritual renewal movements like Pietism and Wesleyanism, or the responses and reactions within Protestantism to the Enlightenment and their European continental philosophy and intellectual movements. I envision this podcast to be a forum that surveys and explores all these topics and more from the last 500 years of church history and brings the discussion to listeners worldwide. And now, on to our show. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever and wherever this episode finds you at. We are very honored to have as our guest on today's episode a distinguished scholar of the Reformation, Dr. Scott Amos. Dr. Amos is the professor of history and chair of the history department at the University of Lynchburg. He holds a PhD in the English Reformation and Continental Reformation, as well, and from the University of St. Andrews, as well as degrees from Westminster Theological Seminary, College of William and Mary, and Old Dominion University. He's been published in journals such as Reformation and Renaissance Review, Renaissance Studies, and Westminster Theological Journal. He's the author of the book Bucer, Ephesians, and Biblical Humanism, the Exegete as Theologian, which was published in 2015. And he is the editor of the upcoming fourth volume of the Reformation Commentary on Scripture series, the one for the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and which if we have time, maybe I'll ask him a little bit about at the end of our episode. So Dr. Amos holds numerous awards and honors, and his areas of expertise include the English Reformation, Tudor England, the Swiss Reformation, the Italian Renaissance, and primarily the 16th century Martin Bucer, who we will be spending this episode discussing and learning about. So how are you today, Dr. Amos?
Doing pretty well. Could do with a little more sunshine. We haven't had a lot of that in Virginia lately. It's actually been a lot like my time in St. Andrews. Yesterday in particular, dreaky, wet, foggy, cold, kind of grim.
I was across the pond there, not at St. Andrews, only once in my life, and I remember that being very common, foggy too. And so,
Yeah.
And it's bucket rain. I'm in Louisiana, so it's raining buckets literally here. When it does, it doesn't rain a lot, but when it does, it's just very wet, and it's just a damp, humid place in general. And so, like our last episode for our listeners, they kind of got a faint, tranquil rain sound pattering on the roof, and so maybe they'll get that for this episode as well. So some podcasts have ambient background. So this will be ours. Well, thank you for being here. And I am curious, because I know you work in academia, how COVID-19 has affected your work.
Well, for me, it's not been that big a disruption because I teach in an old-fashioned way. I lecture. Mm-hmm. And so the university has a couple of approaches to this right now. They've got a hybrid approach where they have some classes in person, or some sessions, courses that are hybrid have a certain number of sessions that are in person with all of the appropriate protections, and then an online session that can either be synchronous, meaning it's at the same time as the regularly scheduled class would be, so that maintains as much continuity on that level, or asynchronous, meaning they pick it up, it's recorded and the students pick it up whenever they can. And then there are those of us who do it all online, synchronous or asynchronous. And I happen to do it asynchronous, meaning that I record a couple of lectures. I treat it like a Tuesday, Thursday class, and I record a couple of lectures a week and post them using Moodle as our point of contact, and students log in and view the lectures and do everything through Moodle. So I have a record of that, and I can track what they're doing and when they're not doing stuff, and prod them to do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So for the most part, it's been fine, but it is detached.
Yeah,
and
it's detached.
After a while, you get pretty lonely for that human contact.
You do,
and that presence.
Right. I was telling Dr. Amos, for our listener, I was telling Dr. Amos before our episode how I work at a pre-K through 8 school, and started out as just a minister, but I became the school chaplain, not long ago, and now I'm teaching 4th through 8th grades. And anyways, we started school fully in person in the fall, and most parents were supportive of that. They wanted their kids to have, like you said, the presence, the interaction, especially for younger ages, it's huge. But I even imagine for college, for an undergrad especially, it's even if it's just sitting in the classroom, there's still the dynamics are still important. Having a live lecture and having that type of interaction. And, online schools are in different places. With where I go, we're live. I guess it'd be synchronous. We're live. Every Tuesday evening I meet, and we do. We're live together on different screens, kind of like Dr. Amos and I are now for 3 hours. And so, it's just there's different philosophies behind how to do education. Different. I mean, this was stuff going on, of course, before COVID. And, now it's higher education has been forced, like it or not, to kind of grapple more with it. So, we'll move right on in. So based on your areas of interest, which, they seem rather broad, broad on one end, but they're all obviously related. That it's kind of a general time period you are really an expert of, but you definitely devoted your scholarly work to all things Reformation in a sense for quite some time. And what led to your interest initially in this epoch or chapter of church history?
Well, my interest in history goes back to when I was a boy, and we lived in Italy for 1.5 to 2 years. My father was in the army. We lived in Vicenza, Italy. So, you're surrounded by ancient and medieval and Renaissance history. And so my orientation was always towards European history, which I studied at university. And then when I went into grad school, I focused more narrowly on Tudor England. And but also cultivated more closely an interest in the Reformation. And then when I went to seminary, I in my church history courses as much as I could, and in the THM that I did at Westminster, I focused on the European Reformation, and in particular began to zero in on Martin Bucer, who is someone about whom not as much has been done as one would expect for someone who shows up in so many different places as an important medial figure. And so that carried on through to my work at St. Andrews, which combined both my interest in Tudor England as well as my interest in Martin Bucer. It allowed for cross-fertilization, so to speak, there, because of the fact that he spent the last 2 years of his life at the University of Cambridge as Regius Professor of Divinity, which was what the focus of my dissertation was on. And so that's how I came to that. I mean, given my own ecclesial background, Presbyterian, I was interested in Reformed theology, and Bucer is again an interesting figure in that respect because he was so influential on John Calvin at an early stage of Calvin's career. But he's also someone who shows up in so many other places. I mean, he worked with Luther. He attempted to mediate between Luther and Zwingli. He worked in the context of the colloquies of the 1530s and 1540s to try to compose the differences within the German Empire between Protestant and Catholic. And so he's just an intensely interesting figure. And so I was just drawn to that. And the fact is that, as I say, not as much has been done on him as one would expect. And so there was more scope for saying something original about Martin Bucer than there would be about Martin Luther. I mean, there were times when people would ask me, "What are you studying?" I'd say Martin Bucer, but they would hear Martin Luther. And I'd say Martin Bucer because not much has been written about him. Of course, they heard Martin Luther. What are you saying? You're nuts. Of course, tons have been written about Luther. No, it's Bucer.
Yeah, it's funny whenever I hear Martin Bucer, it's like, it kind of sounds like Martin Luther, but it's not Martin Luther.
No,
and they're both 16th century reformers.
Yeah.
Well, it's so yeah, we're bringing Dr. Amos on to talk about Martin Bucer. And I have found, I don't remember when I heard about Bucer, some point in church history studies. I don't know if it was seminary or what. And I've taken an interest whenever I've come across him. I've taken an interest in him, but I've never, like you, I've never devoted my life work to him. But Bucer, he is an overlooked figure in the Reformation, and often when I think of when people think of like the top 16th century reformers, it's usually Luther, Calvin. If there's three mentioned, it's Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, of course, who you mentioned a moment ago. And if there is ever a number 4, a lot of times it's Thomas Cranmer, due to him really being behind, at least initially, the English Reformation, the church reforms in the Church of England during that time, especially liturgical reforms. I think even like the broad scope of American Protestantism use it, because the Book of Common Prayer was the first English worship resource. They even go back in many of their kind of prose and their language back to the prayer book. And so Cranmer's influential, but so it's really neat that we get to talk about Bucer today. And of course, we'll be hearing a little bit about Cranmer today as well. So today we primarily look at your work in the article, Martin Bucer and the Revision of the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. And so this article zeroes in on the influence that Bucer had on the first book of, the influence he had, not on the first Book of Common Prayer, I'm sorry, it would be the second, which we'll get into. And just for our listeners, Episcopalians will know, but in the Episcopal Church and in the Worldwide Anglican Church, the Book of Common Prayer has been our primary resource for every worship every rite we do, whether it's the Holy Eucharist, wedding, funeral, our daily prayers, our morning office. That's what we use in church. That's what we read from for our worship. So Dr. Amos, your article starts out with Cranmer after the publication of the 1549 prayer book. He is looking to do further liturgical reform, and he seeks advice from other reformers, particularly reformers in continental Europe, where adjacent reformations, so to speak, were going on. Why did he reach out to them? And, I guess it's a two-part question. Why did he reach out to them? And what was the reason for him looking to do further liturgical reform?
Right, yeah. Well, as Dermot McCulloch makes clear in his massive biography on Thomas Cranmer, Cranmer at that moment came to see that England was in a position to take the Reformation forward in a unique way as a result of circumstances that came to play at that time. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had defeated the Protestant Schmalkaldic League at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, and things looked pretty bleak for the continued success of the Reformation and Protestantism, not just in Germany, but more broadly speaking than that. And it looked pretty grim. And so England became, at that moment, the last hope of the Reformation, because, of course, in 1547, Edward VI came to the throne, and Edward VI and the Lord Protector, his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour, were committed Protestants. And, of course, Cranmer was there as well to lead and finally have an opportunity to openly pursue Reformation. He'd been doing it sort of on the margins during Henry VIII's reign, but you could only be but so evangelical around Henry VIII without risking dire consequences. But now those shackles were freed, and so Cranmer was able to actively pursue a Reformation. And it came at the same time as things began to look, so things brightened up considerably for England, and things looked considerably darker on the continent. And so the confluence of those two facts led Cranmer to see that England could become a model going forward for reform. And he also made England the refuge of choice for many exiled reformers, and quite a constellation of them gathered around his court between 1547 and 1549. Peter Martyr Vermigli, a great Italian reformer and fellow worker with Bucer in Strasbourg, is one of the leading lights, and a host of others who are lesser known, but at the time were regarded as important contributors to the tradition. And Bucer would come to become one of those as well, one of these exiled refugees at his court. And so Cranmer was able to draw on them as he moved forward with the English Reformation, now fully unleashed. And so that is the context for the decision to undertake a further revision of the 49 prayer book, which of course was the first English service book, but which, even to his own mind, hadn't gone quite far enough. But then there was a policy that Cranmer was following of hastening festina lente, hasten slowly, and pursuing a more measured approach to reform, doing it by stages. And so that's the broader context for why Cranmer chose to take up this cause and to take up this task and to draw on these people in order to advance the cause of the Reformation.
Okay. So one of the reformers that Cranmer seeks advice from is Martin Bucer. You told us a little bit about him. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Bucer, prior to his contact with Cranmer, was involved with, and we'll probably get some good biographical info out of this because I'm not familiar with Bucer really before he comes over to England. He was involved with an admittedly failed attempt at the Archdiocese of Cologne, as your article puts it. Maybe for our listeners, could you explain briefly what those reforming efforts in Cologne entail? I'm not familiar with it myself. So I was wondering kind of curious about that.
Right. Well, this took place in 1542 to 1543. In the aftermath of the failure at Regensburg, the Regensburg Colloquy, which was a brief moment when it looked like that Protestant and Catholic were going to be able to come to an agreement upon the doctrine of justification. And Bucer was very much involved in that task, along with Johann Gropper, who is the Catholic theologian that worked with them on the materials produced for the Regensburg Colloquy. But it collapsed because moderate men lose sight of the fact that the hardliners on both sides aren't going to be impressed by these kinds of arguments. And Luther snorted and said no, and the Pope said no, and so it all went to pieces. And so it looked like the moment had passed for being able to bring about a path forward for calming the waters in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire. But in 1542, Hermann von Fied, who was the Archbishop of Cologne and a moderate Catholic inclined towards reform, wanted to push forward with a reform of his diocese. And so he called upon Bucer and Philip Melanchthon, to help him in creating a set of reforming ordinances for the Archdiocese of Cologne. And the emphasis, and the Melanchthon did all the doctrinal work in these ordinances, and Bucer took on the liturgical work.
Very fitting for both of them. If anyone knows that's definitely them.
Yeah. And it was ultimately published under the title of Simplex ac Pia Deliberatio. And the emphasis in this reforming plan was on a careful, measured reform that would proceed by stages, recognizing the conservatism of virtually all of the priests and all the people, but still wanting to find ways to bring reform forward. It took a very measured approach to this and allowed for a lot of traditional things to be unchanged, but made more space for the preaching of the word. And Bucer, as well as von Fied, were convinced that if the preaching of the word could go forward without the kinds of restrictions that had been imposed to that point, that ultimately the people themselves would be convinced of the truth of the Reformation, the truth of evangelical doctrine, and a lot of these traditional sorts of things would gradually fall away. And the result would be a Reformed and Protestant pattern of church structure and worship and belief. And there was a larger political context for this effort because Hermann von Fied was also one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire. The others were the archbishops of Trier and Mainz and the Duke of Saxony and the Count Palatine of the Rhine and the Margrave of Brandenburg and the King of Bohemia. So there are 7 of these individuals had the title elector. And they were the ones who chose each subsequent Holy Roman Emperor whenever there was vacant, whenever the emperor died. The succession was not necessarily to his son or grandson, as has happened the case with Charles V. It had to be by election. And so, as things stood when this effort was undertaken, there were 3 Protestant electors and 4 Catholic electors. If this had succeeded, then there would have been 4 Protestant electors and 3 Catholic electors, and that would have changed the dynamics of politics in the Holy Roman Empire in ways that, well, we can speculate about, but it didn't happen because it didn't come off. Charles V quashed this effort, and so it went by the board. But the other important thing to note about this effort is, politics aside, one of the people in Europe who took notice and followed closely what was going on in Cologne was Thomas Cranmer. And he sought to achieve something of the same thing in the English Reformation that had been attempted in Cologne. And how better to pursue that goal than to employ the draftsman of the revised liturgy for the archdiocese. And so this is part of the story for Cranmer's invitation to Bucer to come over. Okay. I think he would have invited him over anyway, but that gave a special impetus and attraction to bringing Bucer over because of his involvement in that effort, which Cranmer did use as a model for a lot of the work that he did in the 49 prayer book. He actually had 2 editions of that work translated and published in English in 1547, 1548. So I mean, it was already there as part of the background.
So there were some even before bringing in Bucer to look at 1549. There were Bucer was involved with some even blueprints, you could say, for the 49 book.
Right.
Let's see. That's interesting, because I know I've never heard of what was the name of that colloquy that happened that you mentioned.
Oh, right, Regensburg colloquy.
I'm interested in reading. I had no idea that. I guess in that region that Catholics and Lutherans came very close to a agreement on justification. I mean, that's a pretty big deal for that time. If that was I'd be curious. I mean, I'd be curious to read more about that. It's surprising, I guess I could say. Grober, was that the name of the Catholic?
Groper, Gropper.
PPER. Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like this is kind of leading my next question, but kind of going off what you just said, Bucer seems to have had a very. He seems like he was. On one end, I don't want to sound totally cynical, but like it sounds like his moderation or his moderateness was trying to sell. They were just kind of maybe means to an end, just trying to sell a reform. But I do wonder if there's something more else in it. My next question was about, you mentioned in your article, kind of from the 1530s onward, Bucer actually, you say, increasingly valued traditional forms of worship, which I thought was interesting because he's a reformer. And it's of course not unheard of. Luther, for instance, many scholars would argue that he was more conservative, you could say, or more reserved in changes to worship traditions than a lot of the other continental reformers may have been, especially the Reformed. So do historians, or have you come across anything about why Bucer had this tendency in him, this kind of via media, or I don't want to say via media, but more slow, incremental, the way he would pace this.
Yeah, well, he was steeped in the patristics. Okay. And that's something which he shared with Cranmer. It's something he shared with Matthew Parker, who was Elizabeth first Archbishop of Canterbury, and who was actually Bucer's host in Cambridge, because Parker was the Master of Corpus Christi College and sometime Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And so he and Bucer had a lot to do with each other. But you also have to reckon with the fact that Bucer first met Luther in 1518 at the Heidelberg, because Bucer is a student at the University of Heidelberg, and Luther had his famous Heidelberg disputation there. Mm-hmm. And so Bucer counted himself as a Lutheran from that point forward, a Martinian. And that was his profile when he begins his career as a reformer in Strasbourg in 1523, 1524. But he also began at that point to be drawn into the orbit of Zwingli. And with Zwingli, he shared something in common that he didn't have with Luther, and that was an attachment to Erasmus of Rotterdam. And so through his connections with Zwingli, Bucer became more reformed, decidedly reformed in a Swiss sort of way than had been the case before. But through the course of the Lord's Supper controversy and his efforts at mediating between Luther and Zwingli on that issue, he was gradually drawn back in the direction of Luther to some degree, partly because of his self-conscious effort to try to find a middle point between the two, so that Protestantism could present a united front in the empire, which it couldn't at that point, never really quite would. And so to the extent that he becomes friendlier or more open or more supportive or more, to the extent that he values traditional forms of worship, it's partly because of that context. And I think it also had to do with his recognition by that point that that reform would be hampered if you made too sharp a break with the past, in the way that some of the more zealous Reformed Swiss theologians would want to do. And he was, as I say, no doubt influenced by Luther in this regard. And but all of that being said, I mean, even in the light of what I say in the article about he's increasingly valuing traditional forms of worship, Bucer was still prepared for a measured movement away from traditional patterns of worship that would ultimately lead to change that was more rapid and more decisive than what Luther would argue for. Luther was more content to allow things to pretty much stay as they were with adjustments. But Bucer was, and I think in this respect, like Cranmer, could see the reason for dispensing with a lot of these things, but prudently and practically recognized that the pace of change would have to be measured in order to bring the people along. For the sake of the simple folk, they needed to retain certain things a longer period of time than they might want to, with the idea that with a sustained preaching of the word and a cultivation of a reform, from their perspective, a reformed biblical worldview, then gradually these other things wouldn't be needed, and so they could then be phased out, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, that was kind of my what I suspected too. As I was reading, I was like, well, he's a practical person. There's a practicality to his approach to things, and I think there's, in many ways, there's a lot to be said about that, and a lot to respect about that. So Bucer is brought over to England, and he kind of looks at the 1549 prayer book, and he notices, what he maybe sees as weaknesses or things for further revision. What were some of those things?
Yeah, well, I mean, he was concerned that there are too many rituals and actions that the people knew to expect, but didn't really understand the purpose for it. And so superstitions attached to them, as he would say. Elaborate vestments was another criticism. And the practice of anti-communion, going through the entire communion service up to the point of distributing the elements, but then not distributing the elements. And the continuation of communion in private chapels, which smacked too much for his takes of private communion. The prayer commending the dead found in the communion service. And he saw all of these as just making too many concessions. And he recognized that Cranmer was moving slowly. He recognized the challenge that Cranmer had to face with issuing a first prayer book. But he felt that Cranmer could not rest with that the change could not rest with that, and that too many concessions were made that needed to be withdrawn. But it was not always so much the particulars of the 49 prayer book, I think, that concerned him the most. But what concerned him was that without adequate preaching and catechetical instruction, the common people would conclude that all of this continuity with what had been previous Catholic practice meant that, as Bucer feared, no change had really taken place. I mean, they wouldn't realize that there was this shift underway, that they would see this as continuity. And so, what's all the fuss about in that respect? Of course, that's not to overlook the one really substantial change, whatever one's take on the book is, and that's that worship is in English, which is a pretty radical change at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people I think it was in Cornwall that during the prayer book revolts of 49 that objected to this Christmas game. They just saw this as a bunch of mumbo jumbo. We want to go back to the Catholic. We want to go back to the Latin wow. of the Mass.
Yeah.
And none of this jiggery pokery stuff that you're doing in English. And so, I mean, doing it in English was a pretty radical step forward.
It would seem to me that the whole putting it into the vernacular language would seem the most radical, because like you said, that's the most apparent change. Like you said, if you have so much continuity with what was going on before,
people hear that there's this Reformation going on, they hear that there's these controversies, but they're like, it doesn't make any sense to what they're hearing about because they're coming to church and it's the same old thing. So yeah, I think that's interesting, but definitely the bringing it into English. It actually kind of leads me to my next question about as far as what people are hearing and perhaps what they're reading. That's pretty apparent, but what, as far as like rituals and gestures and the things that were commonly done into the liturgy at that point, a lot of people were probably just doing it from just routinely and maybe not even thinking about it. So interpretation was important to Bucer, and interpreting for those who experienced worship, why the liturgy had certain ceremonies and ritual actions. So how does that tie in really to the principles of the Reformation, kind of in general?
Well, I mean, I think what lies behind what Bucer is doing is, it lines up with the principle of the authority of Scripture as the rule of faith and life. And from the perspective, that's fundamental to a Reformed perspective, which, broadly speaking, Bucer certainly represents. Bucer did not hold to the Reformed view of the regulative principle, the narrower Reformed view of the regulative principle, meaning that you don't do anything in worship that isn't explicitly commanded by the Word of God. Okay. But rather, he was prepared to countenance things that were not explicitly commanded in Scripture, but that they should and things could be practiced in worship which were not explicitly in conflict with Scripture. And of course, lurking in the background is the idea of adiaphora, things indifferent, as a principle for regulating these sorts, as a principle for approaching this question of what is permissible and impermissible in worship. And it was incumbent upon, Bucer believed that it was incumbent upon the minister to make sure that the flock understood what happened in worship in the light of Scripture. And so, the interpretation comes in the context of the full preaching of the Word and catechetical instruction based upon the Word. And that's where where, from Bucer's perspective, the mists of uncertainty would be dispelled, and they would see clearly, yes, this is appropriate. No, that is no longer appropriate. Mm-hmm. But his concern is that because of the state of preaching in England at that time, with the typical parish priest, that wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it just continued to feed itself.
Right. And that kind of leads me to my next question. You're talking about the kind of the state of preachers at the time. And I've heard from different popular and scholarly things on the Reformation that, it was the typical preacher of that day was may not even been well versed in Scripture, but just not good preaching. And not, first of all, it's in a different language anyways, but even if it would have been maybe brought into the common language, people would not have been able to get much from it. So Bucer felt in coming to the Church of England that it was in serious need of capable ministers. What was a capable? I think you already touched a little bit on it, but I guess what do you think he would kind of see as a capable minister?
Well, it follows on what we just discussed. A capable minister was one learned in the Scriptures and capable of preaching and teaching the Word, and of interpreting the Word, and by extension, interpreting everything that was done in worship to make certain that the laity understood the actions in the light of the Word. And hence, the situation that Cranmer, and I think Cranmer would certainly recognize that, and that's the context for the homilies, books of homilies that he composed, which were intended to fill in the gap, so to speak, until such time as preachers could be trained properly to then do it for themselves. And so a reformed liturgy, from Bucer's point of view, even if you corrected a lot of the errors of the liturgy, reformed liturgy was not going to be enough without preaching and consequent understanding of how everything was rooted in the Word. And the fact is that, I think that an argument can be made that the quality of parish priests was not as dire as the polemics of the day would have you to believe, but neither was it as good as was needed, and that there were still an awful lot of parish priests who basically came to their position by kind of on-the-job training rather than being university graduates.
Right.
And so, Bucer perceived this, and I'm sure he perceived this by his own observation, and he understood this from his conversations with Thomas Cranmer. And so he wanted to stress the importance, which I'm sure Cranmer already recognized, the importance of having adequate ministers of the word, that there are just not enough of them at this point for the challenge that faced the church, and they needed to work harder on cultivating a cadre, a cohort of ministers who could preach lively sermons rather than ones from the Book of Homilies,
right?
And grow the people in the faith.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned Bucer also had a concern that services were being, as you said, confined to the choir. That Bucer wanted this obviously no longer to be the case.
Right.
I guess what do you mean confined to the choir? What did that look like on a typical mass or liturgy? What was it like? Was it priest and choir then? What did that look like?
Right. Well, I mean, putting it, I'm sure, much too simply, as you would know, the typical church would have a choir and a church in this day, and I'm sure for all the way to the present, but we're talking about the 16th century. So you'd have a choir screen that served to separate the sanctuary, the high altar, from the nave of the church, and it would separate the clergy from the lay people. And the laity could only approach the latter, the sanctuary, only approach the choir screen at the communion rail. And so, practically speaking, and this is one of the things that Bucer talks about in the Censura, practically speaking, one of the results of this was that the further back from the choir screen you were, I mean, the acoustics weren't always all that great anyway, but the further back from the choir screen you were, the less you would hear. So you'd know that something was going on. You could see visually that the ceremony of the Eucharist was being celebrated. You knew, I mean, you had the ringing of the bell. You knew the signals of what was going on, but you wouldn't understand. You wouldn't hear it to understand. And so this meant that clergy were seen as separate from the laity. And it also meant that for far too many of the people, far too many of the laity, that just being present in the church to witness from a distance, even if you don't hear it, to witness from a distance what was going on was all that was sufficient for attending worship, whether you understood what was being said or not. And the laity must hear and understand, Bucer firmly believes, for true worship to take place. And so, his concern was that the separation of the people by the choir screen, and the fact that the people, many of them don't really have any hearing of what's going on, tended to reinforce the separation, the distinction between lay people and clergy within the church. And approaching it from the perspective of Luther and the Reformation, the priesthood of all believers was fundamentally undermined in that respect.
Sure. So there's lots of things about it's funny because one of the things that attracted me to the Anglican tradition while I was attracted to coming to the Episcopal Church. I was raised Lutheran, but I became Episcopalian at 13. And that whole ethos of middle way via media, if you will, kind of was an attractive point. Many scholars make strong arguments, for instance, that Anglicanism wasn't actually some middle way between Protestant and Roman Catholicism, but more so a middle way of sorts of navigating the different theological strands of the 16th, 17th century, separatists versus establishmentarians, Puritans versus non, so forth. But there's always been a sense of balance about Anglicanism. So when I'm reading things about rituals, high ceremonies, vestments, and imagery being so like that Bucer was so against a lot of, I was like, oh, he's not the moderate I thought he was. I thought he was like, and so, but it's interesting kind of learning about kind of his big picture visions, but also his kind of practical steps. And so this episode's making me question how Protestant I really am, even though I consider myself so much an heir of the Reformation. But saying that, Bucer had he anticipated an end of church vestments. And I'm not a highly, if you were to see me on a Sunday, I mean, we're kind of broad church at St. Mark's. And, I see some of these pictures online of people wearing these fancy katas and everything. And I get it, like all this pomp and circumstance, like it's so much of people that can turn into the object of devotion over Jesus. I totally get that. But also, I get that. I also like tasteful vestments at the same time, and so I'm totally comfortable with them. Vestments were a highly sensitive issue for Bucer, and but as you say, vestments in themselves, from my next question, vestments in themselves were not necessarily objectionable to him. What was it about vestments that he found objectionable?
Well, I think it's in light of what we considered already, the question of continuity and discontinuity. A complete continuity of vestments, continuing to use everything that had been true in worship before the Reformation, left people holding to a sharp discontinuity between clergy and laity that marked the clergy off as distinctive in some exalted way, and a strong continuity with previous practice. And so, visually it looks the same. So what's the difference? Especially if you don't have adequate preaching to promote the understanding of the gospel. And Bucer was pragmatic about their continued use, but he was not all that keen on it beyond a certain point. Now, you probably know there's a vestments controversy in Edward VI's reign. John Hooper, Bishop of Gloucester, was quite keen on not having any vestments whatsoever, whereas Thomas Cranmer said, no, we're going to retain that. And in my position as Archbishop, I'm telling you, you've got to have these vestments when you are ordained, when you're consecrated as the Bishop of Gloucester. And although Bucer was sympathetic to the non-vestment side of the argument, and therefore sympathetic to Hooper, he took the side of Cranmer on the basis of authority within the church. And he also thought, we don't need to tear the church apart about this particular issue. Just, not to put it very colloquial in terms he wouldn't use, suck it up, wear them, and we'll hopefully have changes further down the road. But he really was rather ambivalent about it. He was prepared to go with them for a time, but he ultimately hoped that they would fall by the wayside, so to speak, that they would no longer be perceived as necessary or even proper.
Yeah, because I think he imagined, I could see that where if you can't imagine church without vestments, there's an issue, right? It's because it's if you're saying that we absolutely have to keep them, and then it can clearly aesthetically lend itself to marking off an spiritually elite group of people from the rest of the people. That makes sense. So yeah, you're right. The John Hooper contract. It's been a while since I've read about that, but yes. Bucer
was concerned. Bucer was concerned that if Hooper held the line firmly on that, then the diocese would be deprived of his preaching.
Sure.
And his preaching is what really was fundamental.
Right.
Which goes back to some of the things we've already talked about. This has got to go forward for a proper reform to take place.
Yeah, the priority.
So he was concerned that Hooper was going to let this thing stop him from being an effective preacher.
Yeah. Yeah, the ministry, the priority of the word being proclaimed, definitely more important than maybe some of those other debates. So Bucer, your article mentioned Bucer was in favor of the distribution of bread and administering of the Eucharist to be placed. I found this part very interesting in your article because it shows how removed we are from that time, because I don't know, in the customs of like the Episcopal Church where I serve and most Episcopal churches I've been, I've seen people receive the host or the bread on their tongue and in their hand, and it's kind of where people's piety are, right? Where they feel comfortable. But you notice how, or you noted how distribution of bread and the administering of the Eucharist was to be placed in communicants' hands rather than on their tongue. The latter he saw, placing on the tongue, as being communicating a superstitious type message, and it may be hard, like I said, for us to grasp as modern readers. But why would the practice of placing it on the tongue be seen by reformers as superstitious? I was really curious about that point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's as you can appreciate, a complicated question for the Reformation. And Bucer is complicated in this point, occupying, as he does, sort of a middle point between the Lutheran conception of the presence of Christ in, with, and under the bread, while the bread remained bread, and the Swiss conception of Christ's presence as spiritual, and thus the bread signifying and representing the body of Christ, but as nothing more than bread. And in what he says about the service in the Censura, Bucer is clearly on the Swiss end of the spectrum of belief, and thus he was emphatic that just as at the first Lord's Supper, Jesus distributed broken bread into the hands of his disciples, so too this should be the case for contemporary disciples. And if I could, if you don't mind, if I could read from the article, what I say about that. I'm picking it's on page 119. Bucer urged that the statement at the end of this rubric, explaining that no one must think to receive less of Christ than in a part of the bread than the whole, it should be extended to make clear that the body of Christ is not to be thought of as locally shut up inside each piece. Bucer was emphatic that the rubric directing the bread be put directly into the mouth of the communicant be altered to direct that the bread be placed into the hands of the communicant. This was in keeping with the practice of the Strasbourg churches, where the broken bread was placed into the hands of communicants and the chalice was passed from hand to hand. He recognized that the rubric was intended, the rubric in the prayer book was intended to prevent some communicants from using the bread for superstitious practices, stealing away with the bread for later use rather than eating it. But as a consequence, a twofold superstition was in fact fostered. First, a false honor was given to the sacramental element itself, giving the laity to understand that something spiritual inhered in the bread apart from the ceremony, and that it was no longer bread at all. And second, it gave a false honor to the priests, as if they alone were worthy of handling the elements. When he turned to the offertory, Bucer argued that the paragraph relating to the amount of bread and wine to be used should be altered. It directed that in preparation for the sacrament, the priest take only as much bread and wine as is needed for the number of communicants present at the service, and set this amount aside. As it stood, it gave rise to a superstition regarding the elements once they had been consecrated, leading the laity to believe that the elements were different after consecration. He stressed that it was necessary to make the people understand that apart from their use in the communion service itself, the elements remained bread and wine, a point that had also been made in his church order for Cologne.
Okay, so different dimensions of reasoning for that, his insistence on going with one rubric and discontinuing the administering of the bread in that certain way. Some biblical precedents there, as he saw it, as well as, kind of going back to the idea of clericalism that he was trying to combat. And that goes back to the vestment thing as well. Mm-hmm. On the topic of superstition, that's also why you say Bucer was opposed to various gestures, manual actions that were, performed in the celebration of the communion. I think he kind of covered it. I mean, he was opposed to, he was opposed to really a lot of these. So anything more you want to say on just the superstitious piece?
I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, it had to do with the centuries of popular beliefs that attached themselves to the use of a lot of the ritual, the visual ritual and worship. And Bucer's critique, of course, is that they weren't grounded in the word. Yeah, but he appears to believe that they are so infused in the minds of people. I mean, because earlier he said, there are places where he says it's, where I said that he can be seen as taking a diaphoristic approach to things, that things indifferent. Scripture doesn't command it, but it doesn't forbid it, and so there's room for discretion. But Bucer's concern, I think, was that a lot of these rituals have become so infused through centuries of practice, so infused with superstition on the part of the laity, that he recognizes these have to be removed entirely, even if it can be shown that they're not in contradiction to the word, even if they could be treated as adiaphora, as things indifferent, because of the views of the people and the superstitions that they have attached to these have to go. And so he was, in some respects, he could be more zealous without necessarily holding to a regulative, reformed type regulative principle, but just recognizing, practically speaking, we can keep some things because that will aid us in the ultimate goal of achieving the kind of reform we want, but some other things have to go. We can't allow those to continue going forward.
Right. So kind of wrapping up with your article, you kind of summed up with that Bucer. I was reading Bucer's labor in composing the Censura, or the commentary on the 1549 prayer book. You say, quote, had not gone unrewarded. It is suggestive that in almost every instance where Bucer proposed a change of use, conduct, or action that clarified evangelical teaching, there appears to have been a corresponding revision, unquote. So do you believe there is a strong case to make that Bucer had a strong influence on the subsequent prayer book, the 1552 prayer book? I mean, and I'm also curious, kind of maybe a sub question to that, in different parts of your research, and because you've been studying him for a long time, have you seen his influence differently, or have you said, well, maybe I overestimated it before, maybe I underestimated it before? I guess.
No, I stand by what I sketched at the end of the article of the ways in which you can see a definite response in the 52 prayer book from what Bucer suggested in his critique in the Censura. I mean, I'm not going to, I won't be one of these to say, well, my guy was clearly the most decisive influence of all upon this, and we owe everything to him for this. But I do think that his influence was considerable.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And you mentioned though that this is always, though it's to an extent been a speculative question. I'm reading your article and yours and other things I've read. It's pretty clear he had like you said, he's not the most influential person. It's not like he's the author of Anglican liturgy or anything like that. But neither is Cranmer. But they're both of them, had significant parts in this, and so even though to an extent it's kind of speculative, that there is nevertheless, you said there was a copy of a 1549 prayer book. They discovered a copy with lots of notes written in it, recording Bucer's advice, which is very interesting. You wrote about this at the end of the article. You note at the time you wrote on this that it had not yet been discovered whom this copy belonged to. Has this been determined since? Do we know more of its origin?
We're closer to an answer on that. A book was published in 2018 that has a couple of articles that address Bucer in the Book of Common Prayer. The book is Strasbourg and the English Reformation, Alsatian Contributions to the Formation of the Church of England. One of the essays is by a man named Stuart Ludbrook, which is directly on the Censura by Bucer and Cranmer's prayer book of 1549. But the other essay is by the Reverend Canon Dr. Ashley Null, and is very much to this point that you raise. And his article is Bucer's writings in Cranmer's Edwardian Eucharistic papers. And he has examined this copy which is in the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale Française. And he has determined that it was almost certainly used by the revision committee. and that many of the changes that were made that are annotated in this do show that there is a line to be drawn from Bucer's Censura to the 1552 prayer book. And one thing to note is that the Censura was not published until 1577. And so whoever made these annotations in this copy of the prayer book used a manuscript copy of the text, of which, so far as we know, there are only three. Bucer's copy, which is found in the papers of the Parker Library at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, which is incidentally where the contents of Bucer's study ended up at his death. A copy held by New College, Oxford, and a recently discovered third copy in the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale Française of the papers that were originally owned by Cranmer's secretary, Pierre Alexander. And so the reason that you have this conjunction between the papers of well, it's interesting just to see that you have the conjunction of the papers of Cranmer's Eucharistic papers and a copy of the 49 prayer book with annotations showing that someone was working with Bucer's copy of the Censura all together in the same place. So I think it's almost certain that Bucer had, I mean, this is a way to demonstrate that Bucer had demonstrable influence. We don't know yet who owns that copy, whether we can speak in terms of a particular person owning that copy, but it was very close to the circle that was involved in making the revisions.
Well, like the conjunction you say points to it being very highly likely. So, great. I was curious because I don't know, when did you write this article? It's been a few years.
A while.
Yeah. So, so I was just curious, but I'm like, I know that thing sat with more people studying it and trying to determine. So that's interesting. And you dropped you've been like the fifth person on the show to drop the name Ashley Null. I really need to read more Ashley Null because he's apparently a very important Cranmer English Reformation guy. So
he is.
Well,
he's a great guy.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on this show. Thank you so much. I remember sending an email out to you a little while ago, and and I got a response back, and I'm like, wow, I was excited. I've been excited ever since. And
I hope it lived up to your expectations.
I don't know too many people that are really into the study of Bucer. And so, I mean, to have an authority on it on the show has been a huge honor. So, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And we will have the episode up soon because, of course, for our listeners know these are pre-recorded. We don't take phone calls or anything. We don't put our guests on the spot like this. But thank you, Dr. Amos, and God bless your continued teaching and all the work you do and in your scholarly endeavors and studies. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Hi, and thank you for listening. This is Reverend Andrew Christensen again. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes of Doth Protest Too Much. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or another streaming service that lets you rate and review our show, please do so. 5 stars, 1 star, however you honestly feel we can take it, and would love and appreciate your feedback. Also, for any further questions or suggestions for our show, please email me at dothprotesttoomuchpodcast@gmail.com. God bless your day.